everyone to the second episode of the Zoomcast series of Migration and Civil Society Research line of Nova Refugee Clinic. I'm Veronica Corcodel, and our special guest today is Maurice Stierl, a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sheffield in the UK, and a member of the activist network Alarm Phone. Maurice, a warm thank you for accepting our invitation today. Maurice, you are the author of a wonderful book published with Routledge entitled Migrant Resistance in Contemporary Europe. Can you say a few words on this book and what motivated you to write it?
Yes, thanks first of all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, I wrote this book over the last 10 years or so. Well, it was published in 2019. And, I wrote this book maybe also out of a sense of frustration, to be honest. I think this is, at least for me, what sometimes drives research. And the frustration was really that, not only in the sort of public imaginary or discourse and media narratives, but even in sort of academic research circles and communities, and even in sort of social justice movements, where there are a lot of these, ideas about people on the move as subjugated individuals who were passive, out of agency or without agency, who were simply, victims of a unfortunate sort of political fate or circumstance, right? And this quite frustrated me because in both my research and also my activism, these were not the individuals I encountered, right? So I encountered individuals, groups of friends or families who were continuously struggling, right? They were struggling to find a place of shelter, a place of dignity, who were organizing to move, right, in a variety of different ways, and who are, engaging in forms of what I read as political resistance, right, to build sort of futures where they might be free of the harm and suffering that we're currently experiencing. And so, my frustration, I guess, was that there was this disjuncture between a lot of the things that I explored and saw when, speaking with individuals and being out in the field, if you like, and the media or public imaginary, right, the dominant portrayal of these individuals. And so I guess my book was really the attempt to account for their struggles through a sort of political lens, and to really account for the manifold forms of resistance that I saw when engaging with them. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you for that. So your book focuses, as you just rightly said, on migration struggles and forms of migrant resistance. Can you tell us how you conceptualize migrant resistance, and are there overlaps between your understanding of migrant struggles and social movements?
Yes, so I've written about this a lot, and it's still difficult to conceptualize migrant resistance after all these years. And I think it's so difficult because there are so many different expressions of resistance, right? And it's difficult to sort of put them under one simple heading, right? So I place them under a sort of wider umbrella term, which I refer to as migrant resistance or migration struggles, right? I use these terms interchangeably. And I basically group them into three different categories, if you will. And of course, they're not completely separate, but there are many overlaps. But I try to do that to account for the sort of different expressions. So first, I looked into what I refer to as migratory dissent, right? For me, these were, these loud, visible forms of resistance that, protested an injustice, right? So for example, in Germany, I followed a group of protesters who refer to themselves as non-citizens, and they sort of broke out of the isolation of their accommodation center after a friend of theirs had committed suicide, and they said it was due to the really inhumane conditions within the center. And they left this space and organized a huge protest campaign that was first very local, but then, went regional and even national, right? And I think they received also so much attention because of the tactics they chose, right? So they used really antagonistic tactics, right? From organizing protest camps, demonstrations, to occupations and even hunger strikes, right? So they conducted a range of really sort of confrontational hunger strikes that were even, I guess, even within the sort of solidarity scene, there were many who were skeptical about the sort of very confrontational, very risky nature of these tactics chosen, right? So for me, these very dissensual strategies of resistance were one sort of category that I wanted to distinguish also from the second category, which I refer to as migrant or migratory excess, right? So I went to Greece, for example, in 2013 to speak with individuals who had reached Greece from Turkey, but who wanted to move on, right? And who used a variety of not so visible strategies of movement, right? They wanted to subvert the border in maybe more imperceptible ways, right? So they tried to use fake documents, or they tried to, cross borders without being seen by border guards, right? They found a variety of really innovative and creative ways, but which were not so perceptible as the sort of dissensual struggles, right? So this was sort of my second category, through which I also try to think about migration as something which is maybe unruly itself, right? Because it's at least unauthorized forms. And then lastly, I wrote about forms of migratory solidarity, because it was really important for me to also reflect on these encounters at the borders, right? Often between people on the move themselves and maybe solidarity activists, right? So I went to Tunisia, for example, to think about or to explore the forms of solidarity that were created, for example, between families of the disappeared and solidarity activists, as well as people who try to become active in one of these regions where Europe was actively trying to make divisions, right? So in the Mediterranean Sea, for example. So I was thinking a little bit about solidarity as a form of resistance. And so these three categories are, of course, very much tied together in many ways. But I place them under this umbrella of migrant resistance also to politicize them, right? As I said earlier, because often individuals of migration are not seen as political subjects. So that's basically my very broad conceptualization of resistance.
Very interesting. Thank you for that, Maurice. Maurice, so you are, as I briefly introduced you before, a lecturer in international relations at the University of Sheffield, and also a member of the activist network Alarm Phone. Can you tell us a bit more on the opportunities and challenges that you have encountered in your experience of wearing this, so to speak, two hats? And more generally, how do you think we should approach the relationship between academia and activism?
Thanks. So for me, this is a very central question, really. And, I would love to explore this question more, because I feel that there's a great need for that, right? There's a lot of scholars, also younger scholars, who want to explore migration and all the issues around migration in a more sort of critical way, and who might also want to be or become active in some of these forms of solidarity and or struggle themselves, right? And so for me personally, it's not really that I wear two hats in a sense, right? For me, it's more that, and I think I write this in the book somewhere, that political research and political activism underwrite my work, and that they are sort of so entangled with one another that trying to untie them would be difficult or maybe even impossible, right? And I still really think, at least for me, this is the case, right? For me, it's not possible to keep it separate, and to just maybe say how I got to doing research, it was activism, right? So I was really interested in these questions before. I was trying to address some forms of injustice that I experienced with individuals I got to know when I was still at school. And, some of these questions drove me to do more research on these topics, right? And the more I learned about it, the more I also wanted to keep being politically active, if you like, to address them, right? So, you can see that for me, they are very much entangled. And I guess, and I think this is what a lot of researchers experience when they are in the field. It's very difficult when you see all these awful things that happen to not also think about possibilities of maybe addressing them, right? So we see these injustices all the time. And, I think most of us will also at least, find simply, if you will, writing about it, not satisfying enough, right? It's not enough, to address these injustices that we see and explore, the violence of borders, the racism of excluding individuals, the nationalism that drives it, and so on. And so I think a lot of people are contemplating, what to do with this feeling, and also with the idea that maybe research and more practical engagement are not so dissimilar, or are maybe not overlapped, right, or overlapping. And so for me, I often draw from the work by two friends of mine, Lorenzo Pizzani and Charles Heller, who have written a lot about this, and and who have also thought of what they call a disobedient gaze in their research. And what they mean by that is that their research is informed by a sort of strategy, right? So the question they want to explore in their research is, what does the border regime want to be disclosed, and what does the border regime want to be hidden away, right? So the research strategy would then be its reverse, right? So the research strategy should be about exposing things that the border regime wants to hide, and not exposing things that the border regime wants to know. And, this is not necessarily an easy task, right? Because it's quite often difficult to write about migration without then also exposing certain elements of it, right? Certain trajectories, certain patterns, and so on. But at the same time, this is a sort of research gaze that necessitates a critical approach, right? Because at every turn, you have to ask yourselves, what is this for, right? Is this making the governance of migration easier, right? Because you're basically playing into the hands of border regimes and border guards? Or is this sort of highlighting more the forms of violence that the border regime wants to hide, right? So for me, this is a really crucial research posture and strategy. And it's also something that has informed my sort of more practical engagement, right? So for example, with Lorenzo Pizzani and Charles Heller, I worked together on the Watch the Med project, which was the idea of creating a counter mapping tool that would expose not sort of movements of migrants, but the violence of borders, right? And to really map them, to really document them, and then also to maybe make them available for legal cases, right? So, or strategic litigation, right? So for me, it's really important that, this is a research posture that becomes maybe more common in migration research, because, it is more than simply writing interesting things about migration. I think it's about reflecting on, what we also in our research might reproduce, and maybe also the risks that this entails. Yeah.
Very interesting. Lots of food for thought there for us academics, and I think it's the question of exposing what the border governance regime wants to hide. I think it's really crucial. So I cannot agree with you more. Maurice, so over the last years, your work and activism have often focused on the Mediterranean border and both migration struggles and border violence, right, in this region. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, sure. So for me, the Mediterranean remains a very sort of focus or focal point of my research and activism. And I think also simply because it remains one of those, really global fault lines where global inequalities are so starkly shown, right? So, I started to be interested in this area in particular following the Arab uprisings of 2011, right? Which in many ways reconfigured this border, right? So before the Arab uprisings, we had a lot of these quite stable agreements, I would say, between European member states, EU member states, and the European Union, and authoritarian regimes and dictators in Northern Africa, right? Who were in many ways deterring migrants on Europe's behalf. And right, so when the Arab uprising started in 2011, the situation changed, where we saw a sort of political reconfiguration of this space, and suddenly also new or old, but renewed sort of migration movements were possible across the sea, right? And so since 2011, there was a sort of dynamism here that I found really interesting because they completely reshaped this Mediterranean space itself, right? It reshaped how Europe saw this space. It reshaped how Europe engaged in this space and how people on the move sort of took the initiative to enact a sort of longing for the freedom of movement, right? And so I've been engaged in this space, I think, for over 10 years now, because it is such a transformative situation, politically so interesting. And so from 2014 onward, we see how the space becomes even further reconfigured through the intervention of non-state actors, right? So we have the Alarm Phone project, the hotline that is run to support people in distress at sea, and I'm a member of that. And we also see in that year the first Rescue NGO entering the space, right? And in 2015, 2016, we really see how more and more NGOs enter this space, not wanting people to drown because Europe is not willing or capable of addressing these mass drowning events, right? And their intervention, and it's similar to what I said earlier, released or exposed the violence that the European border regime wanted to hide, right? Because they suddenly became present there with boats through a hotline and also through aircraft, that were sort of circulating the deadly space. Suddenly we had audio, we had visuals, we had impressions of what was actually going on in these very remote spaces, right? And so for me, this is a crucial rupture in the border regime, right? Because until then, it was really difficult to find out or reconstruct what had actually happened, right? Because it was so easy to have a sort of alibi in this space, right? Because states could always say, well, it was just too difficult to conduct this rescue operation, or we tried what we could and we just came too late. And now that we know and we know exactly how states or state actors operate in this space, we can actually see, well, actually, you're constantly ignoring migrant distress calls. You are constantly delaying rescue operations. You're constantly trying to outsource this work to Northern African actors, especially to Libyan authorities. And so, we can see now much better what has happened in this space. And I think, sometimes also maybe to go back again to the question of activism and research, I still feel that quite often scholarship on migration is not really aware, or it does not acknowledge this contribution to our knowledge of borders and border regimes sufficiently, right? It's because of these interventions that we actually have any sense of what's going on, right? Before, we had to rely on what state actors were saying, and they were constantly lying, to be frank, right? I mean, it was a constant fabrication of facts, if you like. And so now you have these, counter surveillance, counter monitoring attempts. And I think, for me, this makes this space really still interesting, right? And although it's this like horrendous space of suffering, this is the only thing that gives me hope, right? That there is an intervention that has shown that sort of ordinary individuals can, counteract at least some forms of border violence. And so, yes, this is definitely, one of the spaces where I will, keep an eye on at least. So that's, I guess, how I came to look to the Mediterranean Sea. And I guess just to end, the Mediterranean is a very complicated border zone, right? So there's a need for much more research and a much better understanding of these transforming dynamics there. So, we have now reports from activists and NGOs that speak of over 4,400 deaths just in the Western Mediterranean and Atlantic region, right? Which is an incredibly high death toll, right? And official accounts always underestimate the number of migrant deaths, right? So for example, for that area, there may be 1,000 estimated deaths, right? So it's a complete lack of knowledge, despite all of these interventions, despite all of the things that have been created. And it just shows that there's even more, a better need to have non-state actors intervene, right? I mean, how is it possible that, possibly over 3,000 people die and go unaccounted for, right? It's really mind-boggling, yeah.
Thank you, Maurice. Absolutely outrageous, of course, what's happening, has been happening in the Mediterranean over the last decade or so, and what is outrageous as well is that it still continues to happen. And of course, the question of knowing the different forms of border violence, how they unfold in the Mediterranean is crucial. And I think as academics, we also have a role alongside civil society actors to make this known. And in relation to that, still in relation to the Mediterranean context, you wrote a brilliant piece on search and rescue non-governmental actors in the Mediterranean. And you argued that the politics of solidarity has emerged, from within humanitarian reason, to quote Didier Fassin, who uses this idea of humanitarian reason. And I like very much this idea that you put forward in your piece, this idea of a wide spectrum of humanitarian imaginary, not limited to the military humanitarian paradigm that dominates European institutional imaginaries. In your opinion, how does the positionality of civil society actors impact on the ways in which they imagine or frame humanitarianism?
Yes, so for me, it was always important to think about humanitarianisms, right? So like there are different kinds of humanitarianism, I think, and different reasons to engage in humanitarian action, right? And so in this piece, I really wanted to highlight the difference of humanitarian sentiments that in many ways also impacted directly humanitarian practice, or at least this is one of the arguments I made, right? So yes, on the one hand, you have this sort of military humanitarianism, the sort of European idea of, militarizing the border and in this way rescuing individuals, right? The logic there being the more we militarize the Mediterranean Sea, the more we surveil the Mediterranean Sea, the fewer people will drown, right? Because they're being spotted and they are being either intercepted or rescued, right? Which is not the case. Unfortunately, this is far from the truth, right? The more the EU has militarized the border over the last decade, the more people have drowned, right? There's a sort of correspondence between these two factors, right? So it's basically the opposite of what is being claimed. And of course, through this dominant European frame, you also use humanitarian discourses to legitimize your presence, right? To legitimize interceptions, to legitimize a very sort of critical stance of civil rescuers, right? So this is a very problematic discourse. On the other hand, I would say you have a sort of humanitarian spectrum where a range of different actors is trying to intervene, but they come with their own sentiments, right? Their own ideas of why they are engaging, and whether they frame this as a political issue or maybe simply an issue, simply in quote unquote, as an issue of compassion, right? And so, for example, I highlight that on this sort of humanitarian spectrum, you have really different actors. You have actors that come much more from a sort of left-wing activist, maybe even anarchist spectrum, to more sort of professional humanitarians, right? And individuals who enter the space without a sort of more structural critique of the border regime and the ways in which mobilities are being governed, right? So who, for example, do not necessarily find deportations of individuals after rescue to Europe problematic, right? Who see their action as, I think Miriam Tickner wrote about this, as a sort of minimalist biopolitics, right? What is at stake here is the rescue of lives. What happens to them before and after is not really the question here, right? So, which I personally find problematic in many ways. But you see that there are different actors that engage differently. And I would say that this humanitarian spectrum then translates into certain actions or inactions, right? It's not simply on the level of discourse, right? Why they frame their actions differently. You know, if, for example, they do not see a real problem in the governance of migration in Europe, apart from the fact that people are drowning at sea, right? They might collaborate much more with state actors while doing their rescue operations at sea, right? They might offer information on the individuals rescued to the authorities, right? They might be much more cooperative and in informing authorities about their rescue patterns and so on, right? So we see that when you have a much more politicized position, you might not do any of these things, right? You might see this rescue operation as a direct attempt to counter the European border regime, right? So you might not engage as closely with state actors. You might react much more sort of in a confrontational, antagonistic way to state authorities, right? And so for me, it was interesting to think about this as a spectrum, right? It's not sort of black and white either. And also to say that while there are these different positionalities, they can also be subject to change, right? So we see, for example, that certain actors, through being engaged also sometimes for multiple years and to realizing the sort of political practices and the political games, if you like, at play, they also become much more confrontational and change their operational tactics as well, right? So for me, it was interesting to think about this as a sort of spectrum, yeah.
Very interesting, thank you. And finally, so we're arriving to my last question. So to conclude, I have a question that has been haunting me for a while now, and I'm curious to know your opinion on this. Can a praxis of solidarity with migrants produce institutional and legal change? And we are, you know, our research team is part of the law school, so we're also very interested in this question of how to produce institutional and legal change. And so I'm curious to know your opinion on this. Do you think that praxis of solidarity can actually help us in achieving that kind of change, or does it merely sort of reproduce a sort of a polarization in the scene that reinforces somehow also the institutional position and its sort of consolidation?
Yes, I think this is a really central question, and maybe I don't have the perfect answer, but I think in some ways it also depends on, I guess, what we understand institutional change or legal change to be, right? And like where it usually derives from, right? So I think, for example, and also how we would measure that, right? So I guess in many ways, for me, social change and political change tends to come from the bottom up, right, through grassroots engagement, right? And when we look at the history of social movements and so on, this is usually how change happened, that then also was translated into institutional legal change, right? So I think in many ways the practices or acts of solidarity with migrants produce or can produce change. And I think many activists and other practitioners, also legal practitioners involved in the sort of struggle field of migration, they do produce this sort of change, right? So we have, of course, a wide variety of actors, from activists, migrant survivors themselves, NGOs, lawyers, and so on, who in many ways have developed quite a realistic sense maybe of the law in their struggles, right? So they don't see the law as something that will simply rescue them, or that, you know, once they think they are in the right legally, this will translate into whatever they seek, right? Freedom from detention, or, you know, to counteract human rights violations and so on. Because quite often people who are legally in the right do not experience these rights and forms of protection, right? So I think through the engagement with the border regime and its violence in its many guises, you know, people and activists and so on learn, maybe also with Foucault, this idea that the law is not the truth, right? It's simply an instrument of power in many ways. And so I think, you know, engaging on the level of the law is then also really crucial, because it's simply one of many struggle fields, right? And I think there are many cases where legal or strategic litigation in particular has achieved success, right? I mean, we can look, for example, at a shipwreck that occurred in October 2013, where one of the migrant survivors claimed that both Malta and Italy had not lived up to their duty to coordinate and instigate a rescue operation, right? As a consequence of which over 200 people drowned, right? And so this case is still today before a court in Italy, right? And the outcome of which will be really interesting. Of course, it would take more than 8 years. And so, you know, it also shows that there are these obstacles really, but at the same time, this will be a crucial case. And there's another case that was recently done at an Italian court, ruling in favor of 2 migrants who had resisted their forced return to Libya, right? And the court basically ruled that they were acting in self-defense, right? So it was justified that they acted, and the penalty and imprisonment they experienced in Italy was not justified. So, you know, on this very sort of material basis, I do think that legal strategies are really crucial to develop, right? And to think more about how you can use, I guess, these networks of solidarity and activism to promote and change on other levels, right? So quite often, activists, migrant survivors are, of course, the first to notify someone about a severe human rights infringement. And then it's also on other actors and legal actors, lawyers, and so on, to take this further, right? And to take this into the field of a legal battle, if you like. Yeah, so I do think it's definitely possible and a valuable way to engage.
Definitely, I cannot agree with you more. So basically, strategic litigation is key to, let's say, a legal praxis of solidarity with migrants. Wonderful. Maurice, a warm thank you for accepting our invitation today and for sharing with us your insightful ideas on migrant struggles, the Mediterranean context, academia and activism, to name just a few topics that our Zoomcast touched upon today. I also wanted to thank the Migration and Civil Society research team for their inputs, curiosity, support, and good energy, without which this Zoomcast would not have been possible. So thank you guys. There, everyone is in the background actually. There they are. Thanks everyone.
Yes, thanks everyone for organizing this. It's great.
And thank you, Maurice, again.